Hi, my name is Talia. Welcome to Talia Nerds Out. As evidenced by the title, I am going to do a book review for The Poisoner's Handbook by Deborah Bloom. I'm going to say Bloom. This was a book that I borrowed from Libby. I would actually have normally chosen to have read this. Don't know if that's good. I would have chosen to read this next quarter, but I was on a wait list for this, and it came to be available August 30th. So I was like, I'm taking it because there are 5 people behind me, and I don't know when it'll be available again, and I'm trying to be good and save money. I read it, actually the book will probably return itself pretty soon. I read it between August 30th and September 4th. September 4th is actually the day that I finished it, so I really sped through this book. It was a quick, easy read. I did thoroughly enjoy it. I could tell that she really liked her subject matter and got really engrossed in the story. She did dive into the science, so like the molecular buildup of poisons, perhaps more than the average person might be interested in, but she didn't do it in a way that was merely gratuitous. Like, she wasn't just like geeking out over chemical formulas, although that's cool too, but she was doing it to make a point. So, like, for example, when dealing with, I think if I remember correctly, it was for the carbon monoxide poisoning, where they would use illuminating gas to kill somebody. And they were talking about the fact that the oxygen molecules are attracted to iron. Hemoglobin holds iron, so oxygen is attracted to hemoglobin, which is, that's how oxygen gets spread around your body, is through your red blood cells, the hemoglobin. And that's called oxyhemoglobin. But there's a chemical vulnerability built into, this is what I was talking about, where the carbon monoxide having, or cyanide as well, they would have a stronger bond with the hemoglobin than the oxygen. Now, it says with the carbon monoxide, it's sometimes 200 times stronger of a bond with the hemoglobin than between that of hemoglobin and oxygen. So that's why carbon monoxide is that much, is able to muscle its way to the hemoglobin and muscle oxygen out. And because you have that really strong bond, you don't ever have the redness leave the cell. That redness, which comes from the iron, is locked in to the hemoglobin, which is why you would have this really bright red that would be the telltale sign of the blood of someone who had had carbon monoxide poisoning. Their organs would all be in that bright red. Their blood would be that bright red. It was impossible to hide in autopsy. And actually, you would notice that someone who had had carbon monoxide poisoning, they'd be flushed instead of pale if they had been like suffocated or something. That actually came up in a murder case. So yes, I knew I was remembering that a little bit wrong. Basic idea rights, not completely, didn't have it completely in my memory. Anyway, the main heroes of this story, and it's kind of funny that you can point at a history book and go like, these two were the heroes, like this is like a fiction book. But your two heroes, main heroes, are Dr. Charles Norris and chemist Alexander Gettler. And yes, I am going to be calling Dr. Norris Chuck Norris for the rest of this video because he is, in my head, the uh, early to mid 1900s Chuck Norris, fighting crime even then, as he does in Walker, Texas Ranger. And I guess Alexander Gettler is his sidekick. Chuck Norris had a sidekick in Walker, Texas Ranger, right? It's been ages since I watched it. I used to watch it when I was working night shift in a nursing home. We were folding residents' clothes while they were asleep because we had to do their laundry and stuff. But yeah, I'm pretty sure that he had a sidekick. So Gettler was his sidekick, although Gettler was a genius of his own right. So Chuck Norris and Alexander Gettler were really the main reason, or huge reason, that forensic science finally got taken seriously to the point where it was actually considered to be a deciding factor in figuring out cases, particularly poisoning cases. Because that's particularly what this book is about, is poisoning. This covers the way this book is set up, which is kind of nice. Not only does it go in chronological order, but it also goes and covers as best as it can a chapter for each poison while still going chronologically. Other things will come up from previous chapters, like there is an ongoing theme of the battle the battle brought on by prohibition. So you've got the issues with wood alcohol as an ongoing theme, but you also have later on, as we're going more into other poisons, there's conversations about how the government would add other poisons, more and more dangerous combinations, to industrial alcohols, so that way the bootleggers, chemists couldn't denature, or they couldn't make it so that way these industrial alcohols would become safer to drink. I think denaturing was when they would make them unsafe to drink, so denature, I can't remember. Anyway, so that would be other things that would be coming up. And honestly, I thought that it was horrifying. I never knew that they added other poisons and increased the levels of dangerous wood alcohol to industrial alcohols that they knew people were buying, or to facial creams, or any of these other kind of things they knew would have alcohol in it. They would add poisons even though they knew people were going to potentially be drinking them. They saw it as, well, you knew what was in it. But and they tried to compare it to the idea of, well, are you trying to say we should make that's like blaming us for when a drug addict gets a drug. And my point of view is like, no, that's really not the same, because you're not adding extra poison trying to make the drug more dangerous that the drug addict is going and getting. The alcohol, you are purposely making the alcohol more dangerous in the hope to dissuade someone from buying the alcohol. Completely different set of circumstances. And naturally, people like Chuck Norris and Dr. Chuck Norris and Gettler found it horrifying and really upsetting that the government was using different policies to cause more danger to the public by poisoning these alcohols, even though they knew what the effects would be. Something I also found interesting was that coroners weren't always doctors. That it was a very corrupt system that was, especially in New York, it was covered on politics. It was underneath the Democratic Party bosses of Tammany Hall. And once they secured the election of the coroners, they would basically have the coroners do their bidding. And these coroners, who were not necessarily doctors, would then go on and move up the political ladder by doing what they were told. After there were several issues with coroners, with the party man being found on the job drunk several times. Also, him, more than several times, but I guess the newspaper man was there to blast it on, full display during one particular case. And eventually they just got to the point where they were like, no, we need to have standards. And Chuck Norris was the first doctor to become I think he was actually called, because he wasn't called coroner, he was a medical examiner. He was the first medical examiner for New York. The mayor at the time was not pleased that his hand was forced, so he did everything he could to make that job more difficult for Chuck Norris. But the work that he and Gettler did, Norris and Gettler did, in the area of not only, a lot of it was figuring out how to test for the poisons. Because, their job wasn't to try to find cures. That's not what they were a detective force, basically. They were forensic detectives. So their job was to be able to trace them at the smallest amounts possible. And Gettler, that's another thing. This book might not be for the faint of heart. At some points, they do go into quite a bit of detail of how Gettler would test the bodies for different poisons, and it can be detailed. So if you do not want a detailed description of how he examined corpses to figure out levels of poison within those corpses and to try to figure out what was the smallest amount that he could find in a body, test for in a body. He was very thorough. He would do multiple testings in multiple different ways. And that was why he ended up being so highly regarded, because you pretty much knew if he came up with a result, it was right. Because he made sure it was. And another thing I didn't realize, because a lot of times we think of Bellevue, when we think of Bellevue, it's a psychiatric hospital. It actually was a real, like a full-on hospital. It would serve the public as well. It wasn't just psychiatric. And that was actually the hospital that Norris was previously a pathologist at. And he moved a lot of his workings as medical examiner to Bellevue, because that was where the labs were. They had Gettler set up, and he just had more of the space that he wanted. Chuck Norris also did a lot of the funding himself because his office was chronically underpaid. This man was he's a true public servant. He truly believed in the cause. He truly was passionate about being able to bring poisoners to justice, and also being able to clear those falsely accused of poisonings, and also to decrease the amount of deaths by accidental poisoning by figuring out where these poisonings, what the sources of these poisonings were, so that the poisons could be removed from everyday products now that they were known to be poisonous. And the case of the radium girls comes up in this book as well, with that in mind. So you have things covered like the creams that had arsenic in it, or the creams that had, well, some of them did have radium in it, thallium in it. You had tonics that were taken with some of the poisons because they thought that would be, they had medical properties. I think radium was one in particular that they did that with. But yeah, I found this book to have a ton of interesting information. I hadn't realized that it took about, I think it was actually 1935 when, I have 1920 to 1932, but I seem to remember elsewhere I read 1935 that that prohibition was repealed and you started seeing alcohol coming back. So then you started seeing the wood alcohols and the dangerous alcohols going away. I mean, you still had um, the one murder case, which is a crazy case. I want to say it was Mike Malloy. Interesting story. I also heard about that story from a Great Courses course. I want to say it was a forensic science Great Courses course. Very interesting. But that case is covered in this book. This book is a combination of the story of your two heroes, Chuck Norris and Alexander Gettler, but you also have case study after case study of, you can say, yes, it's scientific case study, but you also have it from the aspect of true crime. It told in a very approachable way. Now, I do wish that I'd had the physical book because the Kindle, it's not very well set up for getting to the end notes because she doesn't number her end notes, so I can't click on a link and go to them. And it was very cumbersome for me to flip through the end notes. And I wasn't, that was a weak point of her book, that she, in my opinion, didn't have as many end notes as she could have had. She didn't cite her sources as much as she could have had, and this actually ended up being an issue for me because I was having a conversation with my mom about the book, and I was explaining to her how I was mentioned that when FDR took over, and as soon as people realized that finally prohibition, it was going to be repealed. They were, the Volstead Act was, going to be no more, and people would be able to start drinking alcohol again. They just needed to, wait for it to be ratified everywhere for that to be, yes, okay, we are definitely going to go with that. But everyone knew that prohibition was going to be repealed. There was a little throwaway line where the author states that churches were now able to have sacramental wine again. And I quoted this because I thought that my mom would find it interesting, and she stopped me in my tracks. She's like, that doesn't make sense. Per canon law, the Catholic Church has to have alcoholic wine as part of the Eucharistic, as part of the Mass, as part of the Eucharistic part of the Mass. I'm like, well, she was pretty well researched. She did mention that that this was a thing that happened after Prohibition. They were finally allowed to do this. And my mom pushed back, that just doesn't seem right. And I have a tendency, I like to research anyway, but I especially like to research if I want to kind of prove I'm right. But I will admit that I'm wrong when I am, and I was wrong in this case. And when I went back to look at Bloom's source, she didn't actually cite her source for this, which kind of annoyed me because I believed something that wasn't true because I thought that she seemed to have a very well-researched book here, and I'm sure that her book is very well-researched, but her throwaway line was untrue. So I pulled up a bunch of different articles, and I put them together in a little booklet here. The first article was put up by Smithsonian Magazine called Saved from Prohibition by Holy Wine, and this is about a winery called San Antonio Winery. And it was a small winery. It had been started by an Italian immigrant, a Catholic Italian immigrant, who then had started his winery. I want to say it was founded in 1917, 3 years before Prohibition. And his winery was literally saved by making his wine into sacramental wine, that being the basis of his business. Because when Prohibition changed the Burgundy, California wine business into industry in sudden crisis, patched together with string and wire and oak barrel slats, love that quote, and loopholes. The Volstead Act, which enforced the 18th Amendment, exempted alcohol that was used for medicinal or cosmetic purposes, such as hair tonics and toilet washers and elixirs, and for religious purposes, specifically sacramental wine. So blatantly wrong that it was something that only started up in use after Prohibition. And her quote is literally, churches were now allowed to start using sacramental wine again. They had been using sacramental wine. And this, the Italian immigrant Cambiancia he quickly adapted his business to fit the situation, in itself a kind of transformation process that became emblematic for the company. Before Prohibition, San Antonio Winery was a small winery making 5,000 cases of red wine, the kind of wine that was sold family size or in jug form to local immigrants and 5 area churches. By the time Prohibition ended, it was producing 20,000 cases. Today, this was written sometime in 2000s. I don't know when this article was written. Well, it was after 2012. So, this article was written. So today, San Antonio Winery is the largest supplier of sacramental wine in the country. So Prohibition and sacramental wine being allowed as being an exemption of the Volstead Act, this saved this winery and actually grew it, made it into what it is today. And if it had not been for Prohibition and for sacramental wine, who knows if this winery would even still be around. And actually, here's a quote from the current family member who runs the business. The whole reason we exist today is because of Prohibition, says Steve Ribioli, after threading his way through a network of barrels and cases and bottles and fermenting tanks that form his family's universe, to come rest near his father, now 90, who is seated in the wine shop near the door that leads. Okay, yeah. So anyway, and he mentions that they've endured, that it's because of this of this loophole. And here is the founder with his brothers in this bottom picture. And the founder is apparently the second one from the left. So that would be, this is the founder of San Antonio Winery, and he's with his brothers. So that was from Smithsonian Magazine. And then this is another article, and this one provided a lot of quotes. It talks about, it's called How the Church Saved the Wine Industry During Prohibition. It's by Nick Hines. I got a lot of my other sources from this article. It said, it repeats the same thing that the last article did, that the Volstead Act had this loophole, had this little addendum that said, okay, well, there can be sacramental wine. And it was in 1922 that Blair removed the ban from sacramental wine, at least according to the Yorkville Inquirer, allowing priests to use wine in religious services. But there are other articles that suggest that Blair might have actually eased up the ban earlier than that, even if it wasn't official. And that's in spite of Blair being very much in favor of strictly enforcing the 18th Amendment. And he actually they have a quote, trying to find the quote, where he said that, oh, here we go. In the run-up to Prohibition, David Blair stated that every bootlegger should be stood up before a wall and shot to death. He also encouraged people to anonymously report their law-breaking neighbors. So he was strong, even fanatically, in support of Prohibition, but he was still someone who allowed the use of sacramental wine, even though he wanted it very tightly regulated. And so they talk about how loopholes would actually, you would see much more wine production that should have been based off of pre-prohibition sacramental wine usage. You would see sacramental wine production go up hugely, enough to be suspect, enough to bring question, are you seeing priests as bootleggers? There were priests who were being stolen from them. Are you seeing rabbis as bootleggers? You were definitely seeing some doctors being bootleggers, and you're also seeing thefts, as well as people who were suddenly finding faith, and they were now Jewish, or they were now Catholic, because that was where the alcohol was. Desperate times calls for desperate measures for some people. So that was the article that led me on to other useful sources. But before I go into that, I wanted to go into another article. This one also had a ton of sources to it. American Prohibition Law, Fake Rabbis, and Other Loopholes. And this was very interesting because apparently it dives more into the Jewish aspect of it. Apparently even more than, of course there was a concern of you might be having Catholic priests who were being bootleggers, which is somehow very, it's just like there's something wrong with that picture. But you had something that was actually called the, I'm trying to find what exactly it was called. It was called the Great Sacramental Wine Scandal in New York. And this had to do with not the Catholic bootlegger priests, but it had to do with the Jewish end of things. And the reason was, for Catholics, it was a little easier to regulate, partially because the wine was used strictly during Mass and during a specific period of Mass. So it wasn't like it was being sent home with the parishioners. So you were having, even more than people who were suddenly finding Christ, you were suddenly having people finding that they were attracted to the Jewish religion because, first of all, it was a lot less obvious who was and who wasn't a rabbi. Anyone could claim they're a rabbi and who was there to say that you weren't. Whereas a priest there was definitely signs if you were or were not a priest. And so that was another thing that made it a little bit easier to just something, I'm a rabbi now. I get to keep track of my congregations, my synagogues, alcohol. And yes, this is my congregation. We're totally, really, absolutely a new Jewish synagogue. Really, yes, sir, we are. So you had that, and also apparently they also had to allocate amounts of sacramental wine that can go home because there were certain religious practices that required wine in the home, which meant, again, more room for misuse. Which I thought was interesting. I did not know that this was just a huge other scandal, and I will show pictures of those articles because I actually found scannings of those articles. So this is, I have someone scanned in a page from it looks like from December 28th, 1919, I can't tell which paper produced this, but this one says church wine stolen through a 75-foot pipe. So this is right before Prohibition formally goes into full swing, which happens on January 1st, 1920. And the theft of 9 barrels of Sacramento wine was reported to the police recently by, it's hard to read. I think it was the dealer, not dealer. That's probably the wrong way to say that. I just can't quite read that, but it was the person who was selling the wine, Sacramento wine, legally. He actually had a license to sell Sacramento wine. But yes, they were desperate and used a 75-foot pipe to steal the wine, which I thought was interesting. That way to start in Prohibition strong. Then you had from the Arizona Republican, Sunday morning, March 21st, 1920. Oh, first let me show you the other, the 1919. Oh, sorry, December 22nd, 1919. Greenville Daily Sun. That's what this one was, the story I just told you. Now, from the Arizona Republican, Sunday morning, March 21st, 1920 edition, we have another article, and just actually a little blurb. It says, church wine lures him from prayers. And it's about the priest thought that this guy was just praying devoutly, and he left the guy alone in the church. He came back, and the Sacramento wine was stolen. So the priest was a little bit too trusting of the person he thought was praying innocently. Now, I didn't remember to print out this one article, which I'm very sad because I thought it was a fun article, but I do have the notes from it, where in 1921, the Associated Press reported on yet another theft. Youthful crime tendency, the Volstead Act, and Sacramento wine were curiously muddled in a story which revealed today, in which 4 youngsters were alleged to have entered a West Tampa church, abducted the wine in question, which they later imbibed. The youthful offenders were not impressed with its quality. It was fine, they later said, though they were disappointed when it didn't make them drunk. So that cracked me up. In spite of the fact that they stole Sacramento wine. And then here from the Yorkville Inquirer, Friday, September 1st, 1922. This says wine ban dropped. Imported or domestic product now allowed for Sacramento use. And the rest of the type is illegible. It's just too faint and small. But at least I had the headline. But then the next one, South. So this is coming from all over the country because we have, this one here is from South Carolina. I believe this is one from South Carolina. I know one of them came from South Carolina. South Bend News. This one might not be the one from South Carolina. Anyway, regardless. South Bend News, Sunday, January 29th, 1923. And the little article was, Priest Killed for Wine, Man Escapes. And when I read the little blurb in the main article, because this, again, too small to be read and very light, apparently the priest got shot in the hip, and he ended up bleeding out and dying. I believe he was an elderly priest as well. And then one of the last two things I have to show. This is from the Jewish Daily Bulletin. This is probably the article I saw. This was the article I saw first. Now, this whole bulletin isn't the story. I just wanted to print out the bulletin so we had the front page. It's from October 6, 1926. So we're smack dab in the middle of Prohibition. Now, if you ever wanted to read this, there's a bunch of other stories in here. That's just Jewish news, Hebrew news, because they are using in different contexts throughout. Hebrew is victorious in Russia. That's one story. Then the other things are talking about Jewish, I guess more in the area of religion. I'm not sure. Maybe they're using interchangeably. This was their paper, so maybe they used it. Maybe they now here they have Judaism and Christianity have close contact. Dr. W.M. Rossenow says. So I'm not sure if they're using Jewish and Hebrew interchangeably, or when they say Jewish and mean more religious. I'm not sure. Might just want to read this one article here just because I'm interested in seeing what they thought during that time period. Anyway, the article I was actually looking for was Great Sacramento Wine Scandal in New York Charged by Prohibition Office. 600 so-called rabbis under investigation of U.S. grand jury. And it goes on to talk about, this was learned through about the United States federal grand jury for New York is investigating the activities of 600 rabbis in New York City. This was learned through an affidavit filed in the district court by David H. Blair, who we were talking about earlier, Commissioner of the Internal Revenue. I forgot the IRS was involved with that. And Chester P. Mills, Prohibition Administrator for this district, in answer to a motion made by Rabbi Jacob Waters for a temporary injunction to restrain the government from interfering with the possession of wine stored at number 124 East 107th Street, according to New York Evening World. Up to the present time, 3 rabbis and a salesman have already been indicted for filing false applications for withdrawal permits. We're talking, okay, let's see. Talk about who's been indicted so far. All the indictments all charge the defendants with having falsified their applications in that they wrongfully stated the number of members belonging to their congregations eligible for the insurance of wine for religious purposes. These indictments, together with the affidavit, confirm the report, which has been in circulation, that the United States District Attorney Buckner has been making a determined drive against the rabbis of the city. Let's see. In applying for the affidavit filed by Major Mills sets forth the methods used by the government permits and describes the means employed to violate these permits. In applying for a withdrawal permit, the rabbi is compelled to state the number of members in his congregation requiring sacramental wine, and upon the granting of the application, he is permitted to withdraw 1 gallon a year for every adult in his church. This application must be endorsed by, they spelled endorsed differently back then. Okay, anyway. This application must be endorsed by the secretary or president of the congregation before it is granted. For the purpose of aiding in the distribution of this wine, former Administrator John B. Foster allowed the rabbis to store this wine in what is commonly known as sacramental wine stores. These stores were intended merely as a distributing center from which members of the congregation might obtain their lawful amount of wine without placing the rabbis under the necessity of distributing it themselves. The affidavit states further that since the establishment of those wine stores, many rabbis have been falsifying or padding their application lists. In cases of these already indicted, it is alleged that the defendants claimed as high as 1,900 members, whereas facts show that there were no more than 300. Major Mills also states that since his investigation of the Sacramento wine stores and denial of permits to operate these stores, withdrawals of, Major Mills also states that since his investigation of Sacramento wine stores and denial of permits to operate these stores, withdrawals, you're missing a comma. Major Mills also states that since his investigation of Sacramento wine stores and denial of permits to operate these stores, withdrawal of Sacramento wines has fallen from over, 1 million gallons in the 5 months from May through September 1925 to slightly more than 6,000 in the corresponding period of 1926. So, yes, that definitely falls in line with the previous article that, or the more modern article that was using this case as a source, the Great Sacramento Wine Scandal. So I thought that was very interesting, and I'm going to end with, this is apparently, so they're talking about during Prohibition, your doctor could write you a prescription for booze. Rub a little whiskeys on, let's see, hang on. Okay, during Prohibition, U.S. Treasury Department authorized physicians to write prescriptions for medicinal alcohol. Licensed doctors with pads of government-issued prescription forms, like the one showed here, I'll show to you in a section, advise their patients take regular doses of hooch to stave off a number of ailments, cancer, indigestion, and depression among them. This privilege was one of the few legal exceptions to the 13-year ban on production, sale, and distribution of alcohol, initiated in 1920 by the 18th Amendment. The National Prohibition Act, which enforced the ban, also allowed farmers to produce wine for their own consumption and priests, ministers, and rabbis to serve it during religious ceremonies. I didn't know it allowed farmers to do it. That's interesting. Okay, presumably doctors were doing examinations and diagnoses, but it was mostly bogus, said Daniel Orkant, author of Last Call, The Rise and Fall of Prohibition. I'm going to borrow that in Libby probably at some point. Every 10 days, the patient's willing to pay about $3 for a prescription, another $3 or $4 to have it filled, could get a pint of booze. There may have been some people who were being prescribed because there was a perceived medical need, but it was really a way for some physicians and pharmacists to make a few extra bucks. Now, I read in one of the other articles that you could get, I think it was a pint per person every 10 days to try to keep it from being abused, but that was if they were doing it legally. Here it is. The prescription was a legal way of bring whiskey into your home, so those that could afford it go to the doctor and get 1 pint every 10 days. That was all you were allowed. 3 pints a month was not enough, so a lot of members of the same family got sick. An epidemic broke out. By the time Prohibition was done, doctors had written over 6 million prescriptions. So, because I was wondering, well, with all these legal alternate sources of alcohol, why were people risking their lives on poison alcohol? Well, this particular last article makes that clear when it states that people who could afford it, because with the case of the doctors, or who were willing to steal it. So if you were honest and or poor, you only would have the tainted alcohol to resort to, because maybe you weren't able to afford to pay $3 for a prescription or 3 or 4 more to actually fill the prescription for the alcohol. So, especially since you could only get a pint at a time, so that would get very expensive very quickly if you were really someone who needed your alcohol. So that kind of filled in the blanks for me, which was my huge question about, okay, but why? Why were people still risking their lives if there were these loopholes? Well, it's because these loopholes really favored people who had money. And even the people with money, they might get a higher quality, but even them, they would still run into risks at times. But here is the example of the government prescription pad that was used to write scripts for alcohol. But yeah, I found this to be very interesting. It was a rabbit hole I fell down because I wanted to make sure that the sources I was going to were sources that I found to be trustworthy, not just Jim Bob writing an article here about something he heard somewhere. I wanted to have primary sources to reference, and I did. Several articles that I read here actually came and gave me primary sources from newspapers at the times, and I showed you all the different copied pages from those papers to make it very clear that yes, Sacramento wine and prescriptions for alcohol were loopholes that unfortunately was not something that was talked about in Deborah Blum's book, and she actually gave inaccurate information, even if it was only a sentence that if it hadn't been something that particularly interested me, I could have easily overlooked. So, yes. As far as I know, the rest of her book has no issues. I do wish she had footnoted or had done more in the way of adding citations, so that way I could have had an idea of where she was getting certain facts, especially things like that, where it was so easy for me to disprove. And that's with me just using free internet search. So anyway, that is my information about The Prisoner's Handbook. I did very much enjoy it. I still would recommend the book, but if you have any questions about whether or not something seems accurate in the book, do some research, because she might still, and she probably is still correct about whatever it is you have a question about, but you might also find, like I did, that some fact slipped through the cracks. Thank you very much for joining me. I hope that you have a wonderful day, and I will see you for the next video. God bless. Bye.